Let me introduce myself. I'm Jim Brenton from the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. That's ERCOT for those of you who don't know how to spell Texas. I'm the reliability coordinator, or not, excuse me. I'm the regional security coordinator for ERCOT. And for those of you who've never heard of ERCOT or don't know what we do, we are the interconnection, one of the 3 interconnections in the United States, the ERCOT interconnection or Texas interconnection. We're also the reliability coordinator and balancing authority for the ERCOT footprint in Texas, and we are also the transmission operator for Texas. We have delegation agreements with 13 other transmission asset owners for a lot of the transmission functions, but we are the ones that hold the transmission operator function in Texas, including transmission planning, generation planning, and a whole bunch of other planning functions there too. The ERCOT interconnection covers, I think it's 75% of the land mass and 85% of the people, or maybe it's the other way around. We have roughly 22 million people in our footprint. Our winter peak, which we set here a couple of 3 weeks ago during some very adverse conditions, is around 57,500 megawatts. Our summer peak is just a little bit over 65,000 megawatts. And total capacity of the ERCOT market is somewhere along the lines of about 75,000 megawatts. And we have a lot of new generation coming online. We just tipped the scales for 10,000 megawatts of wind, and on most typical days we'll have anywhere from 2,500 to 3,500 megawatts of wind. We were having all our troubles in early month. We had almost 4,000 megawatts of wind on the system, and that really helped out. So wind actually stepped up and helped us in during the outages in early February. A little background on me: I've been in the security business for 40 years. 40 years, I guess, is a good way of putting it. I was doing cryptography on Minuteman ICBM control systems back in the late 60s and early 70s when nobody even knew what security was. But we did that kind of stuff with Boeing and the Air Force and so forth. I'm a CISSP, ISSAP, CISM. I got a whole bunch of those number things you put behind you. And I've been a university professor teaching cybersecurity classes and so forth way back when. Retired Air Force LC from almost 20 years ago now. So I've been doing this stuff for a long time, having lots of fun doing it. I enjoy security. I live and breathe security. And I spent 6 years doing telecom security before I went to ERCOT, and I've been there now about 6 years. My previous position at ERCOT was that of being the Director of Security, in which I was responsible for physical security and cybersecurity for the ERCOT ISO RTO, and also as a part-time duty then, I coordinated security activity with the 500 plus market participants in Texas. One of the things we didn't do early on was go around the room, and since we've got a small group, I'd like just everybody, if you could just tell us your name and the organization you're in so we kind of know where you're at. And if you're working with the utility, make sure it's clear, or if you're working as a contractor, make it clear, or if you're a government person, make that clear too, so we all kind of understand who's in the room. So let's start over here with our friend.
I'm a utility.
Yeah. Okay.
And Josh is Alert Enterprise is a product company and services. I'm Gib Sorbo with SAIC, and we're a large integrator doing energy and other work in this space.
Hi, good morning. I'm Jim Loughlin with Waterfall Security Solutions.
I'm Carl Scarborough with TVA, working in enterprise information security and policy.
You one of Jamie's guys?
I'm Fred Hintermeister. I'm with the Navy Secretariat in Washington, D.C. My portfolio area is critical infrastructure protection and mission assurance. And in that respect, my line reporting relationship is with Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy, Installations, and Environment. That's Jackie Fanetsteel. And I also work very closely with the Don CIO, Terry Halverson, and his staff as well.
Do you roll up somehow to Paul Stockman?
Yes, Paul Stockton is over at OSD, and we do roll up to him through programmatic support for critical infrastructure protection and mission assurance.
Let's talk side talk later on.
Mm-hmm, sure. And in terms of the industry interaction there, it might be helpful for some of the industry folks here to be aware, what we're trying to do on our side with industry engagement. Several of the leadership folks at the Navy Department and at OSD now have developed a group where they're meeting with some of the C-levels on the industry side. You may be familiar with that in this room, I'm not sure. but there's an energy security grid group that is meeting, and that's just standing up now. So we're just developing a little bit of maturity in the dialogue now at this point.
Yeah, I've been called in to meet on 10 March with Dr. Stockman and a bunch of folks.
Yes, he's very involved in it, and he's all over this. So.
Hi, David Carter, KPMG. We do cybersecurity advisory work.
Hi, Rita Mix from AT&T. We're one of the sponsors, and I will tell you, Anoop Goyal is here, and he's from our CSO, the AT&T Chief Security Officer organization. He's on a panel tomorrow that's not real technical, but I would ask you to engage him in discussion because he knows way, way more about this than I do. Thank you.
I'm Brian Smith of Internex, we're another host for the conference, and we're consultant in the electric utility space.
Hi, I'm Ron Carter. I'm with PPL out of Pennsylvania. We're an electric utility. I do the cybersecurity for PPL, their smart grid project.
I'm Wes Moody. I'm relatively new to our company's, not new at the company, but new in the CIP compliance area with East Kentucky Power. We're a generation transmission cooperative.
Thank you, folks. I think that helps us to understand who's in the audience, where they're coming from with some of their comments, because sometimes it's not only what you say, it's the frame of reference around what's being said. It's very important when you start working at higher levels of understanding and communications. And I think that's one of the objectives today, is to communicate as effectively as we can about what's going on in the case here with the critical asset identification. Tell you the truth, before I got to ERCOT, I didn't pay much attention to critical asset identification because I was primarily an IT security guy. My background at Sprint before I came here was working broadband security. How do you secure a frame relay switch or an ATM switch, or do voice over IP with their special security for doing secure voice over an internet link, all those kind of things. Nothing to do with transmission or generation facilities. Didn't even understand, and I've had, how do you want to say it, a very large awakening over the last year or so, trying to figure out how to, or last 6 years or so, trying to figure out how you take cybersecurity standards, which were basically tailored from an ISO 17799 standard against the electric sector. We see the 853, the NIST 853 special pub. It talks about how you do it within the government industry, and then you also see NIST special pub 882, which talks about control system security. And there's a few other really good NIST special pubs that deal with that. But none of them really focus in on the unique problems that we have in our industry or any other types of industrial control systems. It's only now that we've seen NIST starting to recognize that and come up with some good pubs. The other question you got to ask yourself is, do we want to, as an industry, do we want to repeat the same mistakes that the federal government has gone through with that thing called FISMA? Unless you've worked with the federal government, you have no clue what FISMA is. It's Federal Information Security Management Administration or something like that. Act. And I think we're getting ready to do FISMA 2 now, because FISMA 1 was such a resounding, not a success. It was successful in the fact that we've been able to spend $5+ billion per year generating paperwork on certification and accreditation with DITSCAP and NITSCAP, and I'm sure the commander back here knows what I'm talking about, but the rest of you just think in terms of writing security plans and getting them documented and filed and following them and keeping track of all that. So the Government Accounting Office has been enforcing that with all the government agencies. They get their little report cards. We've seen the A, B, C's, and D's they get for that. And then the Office of Management and Budget, I think it was, or Congressional Budget Office or some other group went in and did an audit of the Government Accounting Office to see how effective that program was. And they found out that we're wasting about $5 billion a year generating paper that goes into shelves or maybe in CDs these days. And it doesn't do a bit of good when it comes to continuous security monitoring of these government systems, because the Russian business network, the advanced persistent threat, and all other kinds of nefarious overseas people, and some internal people too, have been abusing those government systems. And sure, they pass all their accreditations. They're very much compliant, and at least getting C's and D grades. In some cases, even getting A's and B's, and still getting their websites hacked and penetrations in, and the exfiltration of a lot of sensitive information. So that's one of the things that some of us going into the CIP standards team we're looking at is, what can we do to improve the efficacy of the security and get away from all the rote documentation, and let's start practicing real security instead of compliance risk management. And so as we did this, those are some of the goals and objectives that I had going into the CIP standards team 2 years ago, and partially maybe fulfilled a little bit of it. But we're still headed down the same path that the government's been on for the last 5 years. So from an editorial perspective, I'm not very happy with the direction we're going on CIP standards because we're still focused on the compliance aspects of it and the documentation and paperwork. We've got to get away from that and get into continuous security monitoring, proactive or reactive teams that know how to do deep dives and so forth. For example, at ERCOT, I've got 2,200 servers in our data center. And at 2,200 plus servers, some of it does EMS, some of it does market systems, some of it supports corporate assets. I can't afford to have 3 separate sets of books we manage it, so we manage all of it at the highest level. And that highest level is not NERC CIP, it's our SAS 70 controls we have enforced for our market, and we make sure that all the standards we have for markets, all the standards for NERC, and all the standards for enterprise, all meet all standards, and we have one set of standards we manage our entire data center for. Actually, it's real easy for us because we just tell it everything's system high, and we implement security across the board. That doesn't work in a lot of environments because you've got generation transmission assets that are scattered and so forth. All I've got is a large data center, so my job is easy compared to y'all's. And I recognize that. Why are we doing CIP standards and the changes that are going on right now? Why couldn't we just rely on the old CIP version 1 that was out there? The answer is we had no choice. When we put CIP version 1 out there, it had to be filed with the FCC, consistent with the Energy Policy Act of 2005 and the agreements of the ERO, the Electricity Reliability Organization, and all that kind of stuff had happened. And the first thing they did was they looked at it and they sent us back FERC Order 706. 706 was 218 pages, if I got the count right. It might be off by a couple. But it was 200 plus pages for sure of discussions and recommendations. And I think there were 85 or so specific recommendations in FERC Order 706 that says go back and fix this, go that, take this into consideration, change the wording on that. So in February of 2008, God, it's been forever, that's 3 years ago now, NERC started to work on this. They formed a team to immediately take action. It was called a SAR drafting team. SAR stands for Standards Authorization Request. And that is how our industry works to build a new standard or to change an existing standard, to put a team together to do that work. So we spent 6 months coming up with the rules and the scope and the functions and what would be in scope and out of scope for this SAR team to work on the NERC CIP standards. Consequently, the Chief Security Officer of NERC and Compliance put together this CSO 706 standards drafting team, which would address the items that came out of the Cybersecurity Order 706 from FERC. It took 6 months for us to get that together. It took another 3 months to select the members of the team. They had their first meeting, and I think it was either October or November up at Gaithersburg at NIST. And so in the fall, late fall of 2008, they started working. And immediately took a look at all the 86 issues that were identified and said, well, we can't get them all done right away. Some of these are easy, some of these are pretty hard. Let's go through and let's get the low-hanging fruit, and we'll show to the government that we can do something in a hurry. And we'll jump in there and we'll make these rapid changes. So that's how CIP version 2 came about, was the low-hanging fruit, easy to fix, no non-controversial items. Started working on it in November, December 2008. And I don't exactly remember the dates now. About 9 months later, working on the easy stuff, we had the drafts ready, and they went through industry votes. So by the end of 2009, the fall of 2009, we submitted it to FERC. FERC took a look at it and said, well, we've got questions and problems on this, and you've got 45 days to get this thing fixed right, so go back and do a version 3. And so at the end of 2009, we're doing version 3 of CIP standards to fix the things FERC wanted done. Now, we've yet to really address, at that point in time, any of the real important issues that were identified. We'd just gone after the easy things. The standards process does not happen fast. So once we got that done, we started working on what was going to be called CIP 10 and 11. And by the middle of 2010, we'd made some pretty good progress on a bulk electric system, BES, high, medium, and low determination, and then what you do for critical cyber assets associated with that, high, medium, low risk. We were given a deadline of having everything done by August of 2010, and the standards team basically went into revolt and said, there's no way we can turn out a product. We spent all our time doing all these side tasks that you wanted for the last year and a half, and they said, we need another 6 months. The answer back was, well, no, you don't get another 6 months, so go through and take your critical asset identification criteria for high and turn that into a new CIP standard version 4, which is what was filed at the end of 2010 and is now up for FERC and NERC, or NERC approval now to FERC approval to go forward. We took the most pressing problem facing the industry, and that was the failure of utilities to identify critical assets consistent with a risk-based assessment methodology. A lot of people speculated one way or another as to what the reasons were on that. Mike Asante's famous letter from April of, let's see, it's been 2 years ago, April 2009, where he basically chided the industry that we had not done a good job of stepping up, that the government, meaning FERC and Congress, is watching very carefully, and we're not doing a good job, and we're going to get ourselves in trouble if we don't address it. And he basically appealed to utilities to go back and revisit the risk-based assessment methodology, make sure that it was appropriate, and reevaluate their assets to determine whether, in fact, certain assets should be designated as critical. That effort was going on. At the same time, the NERC CIP committee was developing a set of guidelines for critical asset identification and critical cyber asset identification that you all mentioned there a few minutes ago as one of the things you use right now. But what we have basically is some pretty fuzzy criteria on what is a critical asset. And to be honest with you, everybody's pretty well gamed it to only declare assets that actually have to be there. If there's any question, they've managed to find ways to not declare them. Yes, sir, Mike. Microphone, please, for Michael. Microphone.
Is there any work going on for like a version 5 or version 6? And if there is, what is?
Yeah, I'm going to cover that on my last slide.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So up here on the board, we got the kind of the general area talking about concerns that the government had on CA identification from the version 3 CIP standards. And we're now looking at what changed from version 3 to version 4. First of all, applicability. Mike had a chart up there that said, if you're a generation, if you're transmission, here's all the criteria. Nothing has changed in CIP 4 from CIP 3 as to who it's applicable to. The following organizations remain exempt from CIP standards. Facilities controlled by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. You say, why are we even addressing Canadians? Well, Canadians play in this equally as does the United States. Mexico does not play in this, but Canada does. Cyber assets associated with communications network and data communications. That was an exemption in the current standards. It's an exemption now. We reworked the wording related to nuclear plant security. At first, there was a separate effort where they were going to bring nuclear plant, balance of plant, underneath NERC CIP and reliability standards. And there's all kinds of issues, and I'm going to fall back on my old telecommunications days on demarcs. What's the demarc between what the NRC controls and what's the demarc between what NERC controls in terms of cybersecurity? And they got it figured out all the way out to a transformer in a switch yard from the low side, or the high side, the low side, or whichever way it goes. I'm not a power system engineer, but one side of the transformer would be FERC, and the other side would be NERC, or not NERC, NRC. And then the issue came, well, who owns the transformer? Because you get in this regulatory business, you could parse it down to the lowest thing. Half the transformer is regulated by one agency, the other half's by the other, and that wasn't pliable. So they went back to the old standards, and basically all the stuff that's happening inside the nuclear plant, including balance of plant now, is still going to be handled by the NRC out to this transformer in the yard, and then from that point on, NERC has it. So they're still haggling over the details of who owns the transformer and which side of the transformer has to be compliant. These are the things that lawyers make lots of money on, by the way. Oh, and the other thing, besides changing the selection criteria, given the way the NERC CIP standards 2 through 9 are structured, if you make a change to one standard, you got to change them all. So throughout the CIP standards 3 through 9, all we touched substantive was CIP 2 and the critical asset identification criteria. We combined requirements 1 and 2 together and come up with the tables. And then we had to make conformance changes throughout all the other standards, all the VSLs, all the VRFs, et cetera, to now reflect CIP standard version 4 instead of version 3. So there's a whole ton of paperwork changing, but the substance happens in CIP 2, R1, R2, and attachment 1.
Jim, I just wanted to really quickly.
Yes.
Jim had mentioned kind of the demarcation between the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and NERC. One thing to keep in mind, many of you that are involved with nuclear power understand that nuclear is currently being regulated by the Code of Federal Regulations, and more recently NEI 0809 is kind of an industry best practice being followed in the nuclear industry. So just wanted to kind of clarify that. And if you look at NEI 0809 drafts, they look very similar in principle to what NERC CIP is trying to achieve, and also NIST documentation, special publication 800-53.
Thanks, Josh. That's an area beyond me. Good info. This slide here shows the old criteria for CA identification. Nothing new and surprising up there. One thing at the bottom that caused a lot of people constipation or heartburn or something is the additional assets to support reliable operations of BES that the responsibility entity deems appropriate. A lot of auditors had gone to asking responsible entities, well, what other assets did you consider? Do you have anything that meets the criteria for additional assets? And what basis did you have for including or excluding any additional assets that weren't covered above? That evidently became some kind of an issue. So that wording will be removed, or was removed. Other than that, identification criteria stays pretty much the same. It's amazing how much we're being driven by audit and compliance issues as opposed to security issues. There I go, editorializing again. Okay, risk-based assessment methodology, as in version 3, has been totally replaced by a thing called bright line criteria. That's slang for it. It's CIP 2, version 4, attachment 1. And there's like 18 criteria we'll cover here in a minute. We combined the old R1 and R2 into a new R1, which specifies what the bright line criteria would be. And then we indicated the responsibility entity has to develop a list of CAs through applicable criteria of attachment 1. And attachment 1 is included in the standard, and it's just like it is a standard, but they've got it as an attachment. There was some thought that we could maybe modify attachment 1 as time would go on. New engineering studies would be done, the metrics might change, we wouldn't have to go through the standards process. But we were shot down on that. So given the new CIP 2 version 4 R2, critical cyber asset identification, you now base your list of critical cyber assets based on the assets now identified under the new process instead of the old. And they've added a 15-minute adverse impact criteria for generation units, meaning only that cyber assets must be considered those that could, within 15 minutes, adversely impact the reliable operation of the unit. So if somebody would hack into the, remember that little chart of the generation facility where they got the conveyor belts? There's probably some kind of smart conveyor belt or control system controlling that conveyor belt with some kind of SCADA information on it. If somebody hacks the conveyor belt, is that an attack against the bulk electric system? Probably not. And how long would it take for that conveyor belt being out to taking the coal up from the coal pile up to the top of the plant, so it can work its way down through? How much time? If that system goes out, it's certainly greater than 15 minutes. So that's the kind of logic that went into that, because people were worried about having to go out there and try to secure a conveyor belt control system at a coal pile. It doesn't lend itself to a good physical security perimeter either. Okay, let's look at attachment 1 criteria. We're going to touch on each of the new criteria and talk about them for just a minute. Generating units, including nukes, with an aggregate highest rated real power capability equal to or exceeding 1,500 megawatts in a single interconnection. Some generators put power into multiple interconnections between Eastern and Western Interconnect, or sometimes ERCOT and Southwest Power Pool, which is part of the Eastern Interconnect. So there's some wording in there about 1,500 megawatts in a single interconnection. This has started out in some of the earlier drafts and also within CIP 10 as being 300 megawatts. Through all the discussion, rational discussions and everything like that we finally settled as a committee on 1,500 megawatts. Some people voted no on this set of standards just for that one reason right there. it says units. There's a unit and a facility, and it says units. And that probably, we spent at least a day or two talking about whether it should be unit or plant or facility, and the final wording is units. So if I go to South Texas Power and I've got I think I got two 1,200 megawatt units out there at that facility or at that plant, they don't meet the criteria based on I don't know what Comanche Peak's got. I think they're like 1,250 or something like that. As I look around my Texas footprint, I don't have any generation plants in Texas that meet that. Are there any generation units that anybody can think of that exceed 1,500 megawatts? Anybody know of any? There's going to be a few, but not a lot. So that's a pretty effective new criteria we have there for. Okay. What? Well, if it's big, we got it. Yeah. Well, we started out with 300 megawatts. There was a lot of engineering studies and so forth at 300 megawatts. Having recently been through some generator outages and things like that, sometimes even 15 megawatts is essential for maintaining frequency. So, I don't know. That's what we got. Reactive resources, excluding generation facilities that have an aggregate net reactive power nameplate rating of 1,000 MVAR or greater. In other words, this is to maintain voltage control. You have to only maintain megawattage, you also have to maintain voltage in the system. So if you're a plant that provides, or a unit that provides more than 10,000 megaVAR, you're in. And I've just reached the maximum of my capacity on how to explain that one to you. I'm sure there's some folks in the room that understand megaVAR better than I do, but that's the criteria. If you are a generation facility that the planning coordinator or transmission planner has designated as necessary to avoid BES adverse reliability impacts in a long-term plan, then you're in. So we do long-term plans and short-term plans and transmission congestion plans. So that means that a planning coordinator for a reliability coordinator, balancing authority, or in some cases a transmission planner for a TOP can come back in and tell you that plant needs to be in because we need to avoid adverse BES reliability impact. That could be big depending on how the plans are being done. And I can tell you right now, my local staff wasn't very happy on that because they said, where's our criteria? Because we are the planning authority for Texas. Where's the criteria? Where's the studies? It's up to you guys. You know your own region, your own interconnection. And it'll be the same thing from region to region. If you're a black star resource identified in a transmission operator's restoration plan, congratulations, you're in. If you own part of the cranking path from a black star resource to the first interconnection point or up to a point on the cranking path where there are two or more diverse paths or options existing, congratulations, you're in. This one's been real controversial because in Texas, generation plants are owned by generation owners and transmission facilities are owned by transmission operators. And in a lot of cases, those people aren't part of the same business unit. If you go to a large, traditional, fully integrated, single-owned generation, transmission, distribution, and retail electric provider, you have a certain amount of planning activities that take place in that corporation. We have folks that go out that own generators in Texas and they bid their generators into Blackstar, and they're awarded the contract on the 15th of December, and on the 1st of January, they become a Blackstar resource based on the 2-year contract period. Then those folks also have to basically notify the transmission providers that, oh, this transmission path is now on the critical path, critical restoration path, or Blackstar resource restoration path, and therefore that substation and that substation are in. And they had 15 days notice. Not happy campers. We got that worked out through our teams, but it took a lot of work. And in the future now, when people are bidding in Blackstar, they're in Texas, they have to notify the transmission folks, and so the transmission folks have to be a part of that process now. That's what I'm talking about. It has to be coordinated now. There's coordination allowed. And there's we talked about notifications in the standards that the generation owner would have to have so much time after the award of the contract, within X number of days, they'd have to notify all the transmission operators officially, and it would be arbitrated through the reliability coordinator. It's up to the reliability coordinator to make sure this all comes together.